Hello there everybody, this is Jorge Varela for thebuttonsmasher.com, and here's our video review of Elliot Quest for 3DS specifically. So the short version of the review goes like this. It's average, but I would never recommend this on 3DS. There are some very frequent and inconsistent slowdown throughout that completely ruins my desires to keep on playing. When it actually works, the game is fun and has some good inspirations behind it, though it gets pretty frustrating very quickly. It doesn't stick out in any way, but it's still just fine. Now the long version of the review goes like this. I will never say no to a good old retro style platformer. However, it takes a lot of work for me to actually stick with it to the very end. There are many of these games out there, but very few are memorable. Elliot Quest is somewhere in the middle. I can definitely see the fun in it, but it borrows just enough things from the other games that it loses its identity that it could have had. It's good, but it's no Shovel Knight. Elliot Quest, probably one of the most generic titles for a game I've heard this year, is about a man called Elliot that can't die. However, he does have a curse that will slowly turn him into a demon if he doesn't do something about it, so he explores the world of Urele to find a sage that will make a cure for him. There is some internal narration and a few NPCs that you can talk to throughout the game, but most of the time there's no dialogue at all. I never thought that the story and the protagonist brooding was anything interesting, and neither were any of the villages nor the people within them. Most of this is because of the very simple dialogue and the retro aesthetic. Everything is pixelated and has very simple, solid colors, which makes everything look lacking in detail. This comes with the consequence of the levels, backgrounds, and even the enemies looking very forgettable and lacking in character. The overall look of the game heavily reminds me of all those cartoons that I would watch on television as a kid, in which the cartoon characters found themselves playing some generic parody of a game. You probably know what I'm talking about, right? You know, whenever there's a cartoon show with a video game in the background, but the game has some generic, flat, lawsuit-proof look to the point that it could literally be anything. That instance is what Elliot Quest feels like to me, which expands further than just its art direction. Here's where I first came across the double-edged sword that is this game's world. After playing the game for a little bit, one quickly starts to notice all of the bits and pieces of Zelda 2, Kid Icarus, Castlevania, Metroid, and old Gamefly commercials that this game borrows from. I don't mind that this game has these elements. Iterating on people's ideas is something that pretty much everybody does. However, I feel like Elliot Quest borrows a bit too heavily on them, to the point where it loses any identity of its own. I struggle to see this as an original work and more like a best-of album of your favorite NES games. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can make for a much more forgettable experience. Even with these borrowed elements, there are many small annoyances that limit my enjoyment. When you first start the game, there's one level that you have to go through, and then it'll let you freely explore the world. Because there's barely any dialogue, and whenever there is, it's just the protagonist brooding about his wife, there's pretty much no help or indication of where you're supposed to go. And whenever there is, it's just the protagonist brooding about his dead wife, there's pretty much no help or indication of where you're supposed to go. Because of this, I can guarantee you will spend the first few hours of the game wandering around aimlessly for places where you can progress. Even in places where you can explore, there are many obstacles and objects blocking the way that require some new item that you don't have yet, making you backtrack and explore somewhere else, in typical Metroidvania fashion. This would be fine if it weren't for the aforementioned lack of direction. Because there's no specific place you need to reach, you will come across many different things like collectibles, crystals, boss battles, obstacles, and chests that won't open throughout the game. You will never know what any of these things do or mean until you backtrack a million times and bang your head against a wall to see what works and what doesn't. Even when you do figure out some things, you'll get sick and tired of being rewarded with coins, which is what pretty much every single chest in the game seems to have, which makes it worse because you've seen the same 3-4 levels 1,000 times and then just, oh, look, my reward is the same thing for the 100th time, yay. I have way too many coins. Like, I've run out of things to spend it on, I have so many coins. It makes it even more frustrating when you finally get an item that will allow you to move forward, only to be stopped again by something else that you need, almost immediately. Like having a stone wall and then using bombs to be able to progress further, but then there's a platform that's too high for you to reach, so you gotta go back and find a double jump and then be able to progress. Like almost immediately after you get through one obstacle, you're stopped by something else, which is so frustrating. So if you've played this game before, you will remember the enormous amount of relief that you felt when you got that double jump. And honestly, that's the kind of stuff that made me want to shut off the game and never play it again. And that's not even the end of it. Let me tell you more stuff. So consulting the map, and yes, there is a map, especially if you have the 3DS version or even the Wii U version, the bottom screen or the secondary screen, you can use it to have different menus show up at the bottom, and one of them is the map. But consulting it doesn't help at all either, for it is the most useless goddamn thing in the world. The map is literally just a bunch of squares, which one of them lights up to show where you are. However, that one square could be a small room, or a giant platforming section. It could be a giant vertical stage or a horizontal stage. There's no way for you to tell, since there are no icons, no legend to consult, and definitely no detailed information of what's going on within the square. It's just a freaking square. It doesn't even show you where the entrance or the exit is, or if there are multiple exits. Like, there's no info, just a bunch of squares, like a grid, a really crappy grid. This makes finding the map within the levels the most unexciting thing ever, since instead of just filling in the squares yourself, they all just fill up automatically. But even then, you still don't know anything about what's actually within the squares, other than the room that has the boss fight in it, which aren't all that fun or memorable either. Which reminds me, if you're planning on getting this game, let me give you some advice. Do not buy the 3DS version ever. Do not buy it. This review was made with that version, and it was excruciating. This is because of the massive amount of slowdown that the levels have, seemingly at random. There's some levels that run at a smooth 60 FPS, but I've seen those same levels dip to less than half the speed simply because there was a jar on screen. Just one unmoving tiny jar on screen, and then you destroy it and the frame rate immediately goes back up. To make it even stranger, whenever I rebooted the game, it would go back to running just fine, but then another different level would have even worse slowdown. It got so bad that it actually interfered with my performance in the game. I have lost count on how many times I've fallen into pits because the game got back to 60 FPS while I was in midair, catching me off guard and sending me to my death. This usually would send me very far back to almost the beginning of a level, since the checkpoints are very few and far away from each other. The bigger the levels were, the slower the game got, which I simply couldn't stand. I firmly believe that there is a special place in hell where you're forced to beat this game with this horrendous slowdown. As far as I know, I haven't seen this problem in any other version, so please steer clear of the 3DS version and play this game somewhere else if you're still determined to check this out. But in conclusion, the more I think about this game, the angrier I get, honestly. It's weird because I recall actually enjoying myself for a little bit there. But the more I think about the game's shortcomings, the more I realize that I don't really like this game at all. All of the neat ideas it had are things that you can already see be done somewhere else, like, Zelda 2, like Castlevania, and all those other games that it takes from. And neither the story or its platforming is good enough to hold my interest for long. There are definitely many other pixelated 2D platformers these days that you can play that are way better than this. If you're the kind of person that hasn't played a retro platformer in years and wish to get back into it, then this will probably be fine. It'll probably be a fun nostalgia trip for you. However, if you're a seasoned veteran of the genre, you're probably not reading this review and trying to beat Shovel Knight for the 100th time instead.